Welcome to this explainer. We're diving straight into the astonishing depth behind the creator's names. Let's go. Think about this. What if encountering the absolute presence of the creator directly would literally destroy you? That's where Esma-ul Husna kicks in. It's like an atmospheric filter, safely reflecting divine attributes down to us. Now get this. The phrase Bismillah essentially acts as the creator's introductory business card to humanity. And what's on that card? Out of everything, he chose to lead with pure compassion and mercy. People often reduce this to just memorization. But the actual goal? A lifelong struggle for real moral transformation. Seriously, did prophets endure lifelong struggles and sacrifices just to memorize 99 empty words? No way. These 5 core purposes prove the names aren't just grand theology. They actively build our daily human character. So, how do we actually apply this stuff? Let's bring these grand concepts down to our everyday lives. This means balancing daily actions like sharing household charity and deeply respecting prophets without crossing into actual worship. We've got to avoid extreme flattery. The right path is the sincere, balanced respect the early companions practiced. I'll leave you with this. Heaven isn't cheap. So, are you truly ready to put in the work?
Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever actually stopped to wonder how an infinite, totally limitless creator connects with our finite, chaotic, everyday lives? I mean, does the divine ever just feel a bit too distant? Well, today we are going to trace a truly fascinating intellectual journey that bridges that exact gap. We're diving into a thought-provoking lecture by Islamic scholar Mustafa İslamoğlu to unpack a really profound theological framework. And what's so captivating about this material is how it connects the grand, infinite nature of divine revelation all the way down to the nitty-gritty of our everyday human actions. So here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering Section 1, Revelation and Divine Closeness. Section 2, Asma, the Divine Manifestation Veil. Section 3, The True Meaning of 99 Names. Section 4, Worship, Prayer, and Gaza. And finally, Section 5, Balanced Respect for the Prophet. Let's get right into it.
Section 1, Revelation and Divine Closeness. The encounter in Surah An-Najm.
Let's start with the macro perspective, the absolute highest level of divine interaction. The lecture anchors itself in the prophet's profound encounter with the angel of revelation, which is vividly described in Surah Al-Najm. Now, to understand the sheer intimacy of this moment, we have to look at the specific Arabic idiom used here, qaba qawsayn, which literally translates to two bow lengths. Historically, when two rival tribes wanted to forge an unbreakable peace, the two leaders would physically bring their bows together and fire a single arrow. This meant absolute unity. The speaker beautifully uses this idiom to illustrate just how incredibly close the prophet was to the source of revelation. I mean, the imagery here means there was absolutely zero distance, just a perfect, unfiltered connection between the divine message and the human receiver.
Section 2, Esma, the Divine Manifestation Veil, and how God interacts with the universe.
But okay, that idea of a perfect, close connection raises a really profound, almost paradoxical philosophical question. How exactly does an infinite, limitless God interact with a finite, limited universe without utterly destroying it? Think about trying to stare directly at the sun. You can't do it, right? It's blinding, it damages your eyes. Similarly, the speaker explains that if creation were to come into direct, unfiltered contact with God's pure essence, the overwhelming magnitude of it would literally burn creation to a crisp. We simply couldn't handle the raw reality of it. So, because of that, God interacts with us through a protective sieve, or kind of like an atmosphere. This atmosphere consists of his names and attributes, known in Islamic theology as Asma. Through this veil, creation safely receives his reflection, his mercy, and his guidance, without being consumed by his raw essence.
And that brings us to a brilliant aphorism from the lecture. To see is to limit. Think about human vision for a second. In order for our eyes to focus on an object, whether it's an apple or a giant mountain, that object has to have edges. It must have defined boundaries. Our entire human experience is built on comprehending things that start somewhere and end somewhere else. Because human vision, and really human intellect by extension, requires these boundaries to function, it is physically and philosophically impossible for us to visually comprehend an infinite, completely limitless God.
The speaker then expands on this limitation with another super powerful thought. Whoever tries to know everything knows nothing.
You know, we often see this modern arrogance in human intellect today, where we kind of feel we can decode and master the entire universe. But attempting to grasp the absolute entirety of the divine, it's a totally futile endeavor. Claiming to see or comprehend everything is a massive overstep of our human boundaries. Accepting our finite nature isn't a weakness. Actually, scratch that, it's a deeply liberating theological stance. It frees us from the impossible burden of trying to box in the infinite.
So, if we can't grasp the whole shebang, what do? Well, we understand God through the specific reflections of his names. The lecture uses this really fascinating example of a doctor to explain it. Imagine an eye doctor. This doctor marvels at the Creator not by trying to comprehend the entire cosmos all at once, but through the intricate, hyper-focused science of human vision. By studying the microscopic wonder of the cornea, the stunning complexity of the optic nerve, and how light translates into images in the brain, the doctor taps into the specific divine attributes of the Creator. We learn about the infinite through the highly specific, focused pursuit of knowledge. It's like finding the universe in a single drop of water.
Section 3. The true meaning of 99 names. Moving beyond rote memorization. This brings us to an absolutely crucial question regarding the 99 names of God, the Esma-ul Husna. Is merely memorizing 99 words the magical key to heaven? The speaker firmly challenges this very common, almost transactional mentality found in some communities. He argues passionately against treating these profound names as just a simple checklist. Just think about the immense suffering, the trials, and the heavy prices that early prophets and believers endured for their faith. Did they really go through all of that heartbreak and struggle just so later generations could recite a list of words to guarantee paradise? No way. The answer, of course, is a resounding no.
Rather than treating the names as a magical incantation, the lecture distills several vital, transformative reasons for actually internalizing the Asma. It's about building a solid theology so we actually know God from his own words. But most importantly, it's about internalizing these names as moral codes to reflect divine behavior in our own human lives. For instance, if you understand God as the provider, you should actively strive to be generous to those around you. If God is the most merciful, we have to manifest actual, tangible mercy in our daily actions and how we treat people who make mistakes. Plus, internalizing these traits is exactly how we ensure our prayers are accepted, because we're aligning our very character with the divine attributes. The 99 names are meant to be actively lived out, not just passively memorized.
Section 4. Worship, Prayer, and Gaza. Taking theology into the real world.
Now let's pivot and explore how this profound theology applies to the real, often painful human world around us. How does understanding God's names actually change how we act? The speaker notes that physical worship is deeply symbolic. Take prostration, or sajdah, the act of placing our forehead on the ground in prayer. The explainer highlights that this isn't just a physical movement. It is a powerful, active surrender. You are literally taking the highest part of yourself, your intellect, your pride, your ego, and placing it onto the lowest point, the physical ground. It's the ultimate act of sacrificing the human ego before the divine, declaring that despite all of our human knowledge, we submit to something greater. Addressing real-world applications and deep tragedies, the speaker clarifies a really specific point of Islamic jurisprudence regarding the Qunut prayer. He clearly differentiates between two types of prayer here. First, there's the standard daily Vitir Qunut, performed before the bowing position, which is just part of regular worship. But then there's the Mu-Shan Qunut, which is performed after the bowing position. Now, this isn't an everyday practice. It is specifically invoked for extraordinary circumstances and intense collective crises, such as the deeply tragic events unfolding in Gaza. The very structure of the prayer literally changes to accommodate the weight and gravity of a collective emergency. Speaking of crises, the speaker recounts a deeply emotional morning prayer at the historic Sultanahmet Mosque, a prayer specifically dedicated to Gaza. Just think about this number for a second. 34,000. He describes an incredible, overwhelming turnout where the mosque completely filled up inside and an overflow of 34,000 people gathered outside. Picture standing in the freezing January cold, shivering, yet completely united in a shared mourning. To put that into perspective, that's enough people to fill a major sports arena. It's a really powerful testament to how faith, combined with raw human sorrow, can mobilize a massive community to stand in absolute solidarity.
In another, more everyday practical application during a Q&A session, the speaker addresses household charity. And he strongly pushes back against the idea of strict financial control, where the household budget is viewed entirely as the husband's sole possession. Instead, he heavily advocates for shared autonomy.
Based on historical examples in text, he affirms that women have the independent, unquestioned right to give charity, or infaq, from the shared family budget. This isn't just some abstract financial rule. It's a deeply empowering stance for women's moral autonomy and agency within the home, correcting a lot of modern cultural misconceptions.
Section 5. Balanced respect for the prophet, avoiding extremes in adoration. In our final section, this explainer shifts to a very delicate and really important topic: how we should appropriately honor and respect the Prophet Muhammad. The lecture offers a sharp critique of a practice that has grown over centuries, the habit of attaching overly long, highly exaggerated, and almost mystical titles to the prophet. The speaker describes this phenomenon brilliantly as a spiritual bribe. What a phrase, right? Think about it. As generations found it harder and harder to actually embody and follow the prophet's difficult, patient, and charitable real-world example, they compensated. It became so much easier to just praise him with grand, empty titles than to actually wake up and live like him.
To back this up, the speaker points out that the prophet himself was the one constantly pushing back against this exact behavior. He was desperate to keep the focus on God, not himself. He urged his followers not to exaggerate his status to the point of divinity, referencing the historical trajectory of how other faiths elevated the Son of Mary. He firmly insisted on his humanity, emphasizing that strict monotheism must always be preserved. He is, first and foremost, the servant of God, and only then his messenger.
So, the speaker outlines a much more balanced, grounded approach to respect, structured in 3 easy steps. First, we must actively avoid extreme, excessive praise that borders on assigning him divine powers. Second, and think about how often we actually do this, we must reject using his name or specific prayers as a transactional spell to unlock worldly desires or solve our material problems. He's a guide, for sure, but not a genie. And third, we should address him with genuine, sincere warmth. Whether it's calling him Muhammad, the messenger of God, or our master, it should be done with natural affection that fits the context. We really need to replace rigid, overly formal theatrics with sincere warmth. So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder today, and it really summarizes everything we've looked at in this explainer. Are we just decorating our words with long titles, or are we truly living out the profound truths of this theology? Whether it's understanding the 99 names, engaging in genuine prayer for those suffering, or showing sincere respect to the prophet, the ultimate goal isn't what we say, it's how we live. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring these deep questions.
Imagine for a moment that you decide you want to truly, deeply understand the nature of light.
Mm-hmm.
Like you are totally tired of reading physics textbooks or, looking at diagrams of photons. You want to experience it at its absolute most unfiltered source.
Right. Go straight to the origin.
Exactly. So you walk out your front door, you bypass the gentle morning glow filtering through the trees, you ignore the soft reflections on a pond, you tilt your head all the way back, and you just stare directly into the midday sun.
Oh, wow.
You lock your eyes onto that raging ball of nuclear fusion. What actually happens next?
I mean, medically speaking, your optic nerve overloads almost instantly.
Right.
The cornea literally blisters. Like the very mechanism in your body that's designed to process light is just completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume and intensity of it.
It's too much data.
Way too much. So the thing you were trying to understand ends up permanently destroying your capacity to see anything at all.
You just go blind. I mean, to actually see the light, to use it to navigate your daily life or, appreciate colors, you need distance. You need the Earth's atmosphere.
Or you need a buffer.
Yes, this massive invisible filter suspended in the sky to catch all that lethal radiation, diffuse the blinding intensity, and basically scatter it into a soft blue canopy.
You need a screen.
Exactly.
Oh.
You need a screen between you and the raw, unbridled energy of that star. And today, we are taking that physical reality, the absolute necessity of a filter, to survive an encounter with overwhelming power, and we are applying it to something way beyond astrophysics.
It's such a profound framing.
We're applying it to the ultimate nature of the divine.
Yeah, and it perfectly sets up the incredibly dense, challenging material we're unpacking today.
It really does.
Because we are taking a deep dive into an extensive, and I mean deeply analytical lecture by the Turkish scholar Mustafa İslamoğlu.
It's a huge text.
It is. He uses the Islamic concept of the Esma-ul Husna, the beautiful names of God, to basically deconstruct the mechanics of revelation, the hard limits of human perception, and how these ancient religious traditions can be viewed through a fiercely logical, highly practical lens today.
But before we go any further, we need to set some quick parameters for you, the listener. Because, well, Whether you are deeply religious or casually curious or completely agnostic or purely secular,
Right.
the source material we are going through today is essentially a masterclass in how human beings attempt to process the concept of infinity.
Well, that's a great way to put it.
It's a look at how we construct meaning, how we challenge deeply entrenched historical dogma, and how a person tries to separate true lived morality from, empty performative rituals.
And because we are dealing with a text that makes very strong theological arguments, we definitely need a quick disclaimer here.
Yeah, absolutely.
In this lecture, the speaker makes passionate arguments regarding faith, and he offers some very pointed critiques of both atheism and specific traditionalist religious sects.
He does not hold back.
He really doesn't. So we are here strictly as your neutral guides. We are not endorsing, nor are we rejecting any of these viewpoints.
Right, we're just unpacking it.
Exactly. Our mission is just to explore the historical and philosophical mechanics of his thought process and lay it all out clearly so you can examine the logic for yourself.
So jumping right in, the source material plunges us straight into the deep end of the cosmic pool by analyzing a specific chapter in the Quran, Surah Anam.
Right.
And the speaker focuses on this description of the angel Gabriel delivering revelation to the Prophet Muhammad.
Mm-hmm.
He zeroes in on an incredibly specific phrase used to describe the distance between them during this encounter.
Yeah, the text says they were at a distance of 2 bow lengths.
Right, 2 bow lengths. In Turkish, it's iki aralun.
Mm-hmm.
When I first read that, my modern brain just immediately did the math. Like, okay, a bow is maybe 5 feet long, so they're roughly 10 feet apart.
Right, you're picturing an architectural blueprint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But treating it as a literal unit of measurement just completely misses the point, doesn't it?
It misses the entire cultural universe behind the phrase. To really understand why that specific idiom is used, you have to mentally transport yourself back to the pre-Islamic Arab cultural backdrop.
Okay, take us there.
So in the harsh environment of the desert, tribal alliances and enmities weren't just politics. They were absolute matters of life, death, and daily survival.
Trust was everything.
Trust was the currency of existence. So when 2 rival tribes, or even 2 allied tribes, wanted to declare a state of absolute unbreakable peace...
Like a total merger.
Exactly. When they wanted to signal to the entire peninsula a complete synergy of their fates, the 2 tribal leaders would physically convene.
Okay.
They would take their individual hunting or war bows and physically place them one over the other, so the 2 arcs perfectly aligned to form a single reinforced bow.
Oh, wow.
And then they would draw back a single arrow and fire it together.
Hey, they literally shoot 1 arrow from 2 combined bows.
They literally shoot 1 arrow. It was a physical manifestation of a profound social contract.
That is an intense visual.
The semiotics of that action are incredibly heavy. It told the world, our friend is exactly the same person. Our enemy is exactly the same person. There is 0 daylight between your cause and my cause.
So 0 distance.
Exactly. There is 0 distance between us. So when the text uses 2 bow lengths to describe the proximity of the divine revelation coming down through Gabriel to the prophet, it's not giving us a tape measure reading.
Right.
It's invoking an ancient, visceral idiom to declare that in the moment of revelation, there was absolute flawless alignment.
So like a corporate merger where 2 massive companies combine their logos to show absolute synergy,
Yeah.
but on a cosmic scale.
That's a very modern way to look at it, but yeah. The sender and the receiver were so perfectly unified in purpose that the distance between the divine will and the human reception collapsed to absolute 0.
Hold on, though. If the distance collapses to 0, doesn't that imply the human, becomes divine? Isn't that crossing a massive theological red line? Because in a strictly monotheistic framework, the creator and the creation are supposed to be entirely separate.
Yes, highly separate.
So if they are merged like 2 corporate entities, how does the mortal survive the encounter without basically short-circuiting or losing their humanity entirely?
And that is the core philosophical problem the speaker introduces right here. It leads to some fascinating speculation about the nature of revelation itself.
Okay.
Because the merger here isn't a blending of essence. The human doesn't become a god. It is a perfect alignment of frequency.
Frequency. Like tuning a radio.
Exactly. Think of revelation not as a distant boss shouting orders down a crackly telephone line to a middle manager, or, an email sent from the heavens.
Right.
The speaker envisions it as an intimate, incredibly intense, almost overwhelming transfer of raw truth.
So it requires the receiver's internal frequency to be flawlessly tuned to the sender's transmission.
Right. But human beings are inherently fragile, finite creatures. If the ultimate truth is infinitely powerful, direct, unmediated exposure to its raw essence would be completely destructive.
Right back to staring at the sun.
Exactly. We simply do not have the hardware to process infinity.
So that the two bows metaphor implies an impossible closeness. But human hardware shatters when exposed to the infinite. There has to be some sort of buffer, right?
Right.
Otherwise, the encounter is just fatal.
Yes. And this is where the speaker introduces the concept of the Esma-ul Husna, the beautiful names of God, as that exact buffer.
Oh, interesting.
He argues vehemently that these names, like the Merciful, the Knowing, they aren't just a list of honorary titles you recite to show reverence.
Like titles of nobility.
Right, it's not that. He defines them functionally. He calls them a protective screen or a veil. The Turkish word he uses is perd.
A screen. I'm trying to visualize this. When I hear screen, I think of a movie projector screen. Or maybe like a mesh window screen keeping the bugs out.
A filter is really the most accurate way to conceptualize it. He argues that without this screen, without the names acting as an intermediary translational layer, creation would literally burn from direct exposure to God's raw essence.
Wow.
The created universe cannot interact with the pure, unmediated essence of the divine. It's too vast, it's too absolute, too formless for a bounded mind to grasp.
So we can only interact with its manifestations.
Exactly. Its outward attributes, which are codified for human understanding as the names, so we can interact with the concept of mercy, we can interact with infinite forgiveness.
We can try to comprehend absolute knowledge.
Right. But the raw engine generating those qualities remains behind the veil.
Okay, this brings me right back to the sun analogy we started with. Because what he is describing is essentially the theological equivalent of the Earth's ozone layer.
Yes.
The sun is this chaotic, terrifying reactor emitting lethal radiation. If that hit us directly, the planet would just be a sterilized rock.
Totally lifeless.
But the atmosphere acts as a perde, a screen. It filters the lethal cosmic radiation, and what actually makes it down to the surface is a warm, life-giving breeze.
It steps down the power.
Right. It translates deadly, incomprehensible power into something we can thrive on. So the names of God are the spiritual ozone layer. They take the terrifying reality of the infinite and step it down into manageable, relatable frequencies.
That ozone layer analogy maps perfectly onto the speaker's framework. And to illustrate this stepping down of infinite power, the speaker references a very specific, highly mystical image from the Islamic lore surrounding the revelation.
What's the image?
The Lot tree of the utmost boundary, known as the Sidrat al-Muntaha.
Oh, right.
In the cosmological narrative of the Prophet's night journey, this tree represents the absolute final frontier of created knowledge. It is the boundary where even the angel Gabriel must stop, unable to proceed further into the divine presence.
So it's the ultimate border.
Right. And the speaker describes this tree not as a literal piece of cosmic foliage, but as the ultimate boundary of human perception. It acts as a backdrop or a screen, with the eternal paradise functioning as the deep background.
The tree is the atmosphere.
Exactly. It's the final mechanism that filters the overwhelming reality of the divine so the human mind can engage without disintegrating.
But, it begs the question, if we are only ever experiencing the filter, if we are only ever feeling the diffuse warmth of the sun and never actually touching the star itself, are we missing the real thing?
That's the existential anxiety, isn't it?
Yeah. Are we just getting a watered-down, heavily redacted version of reality?
The speaker actually anticipates that exact anxiety, and his answer is rooted in a deep pragmatism.
How so?
He explains that the filter is the only way for the finite to experience the infinite. You aren't missing the real thing. You are experiencing the real thing in the only format your specific biological and spiritual hardware can possibly process.
Oh, so it's a hardware limitation, not a withholding of truth.
Precisely. Furthermore, he argues that this filter is deeply intentional and it's benevolent.
Benevolent?
Yes. To prove this, he points to the Bismillah, the foundational phrase, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful.
Right, which precedes almost every chapter of the Quran.
Exactly. He asks a really striking question. Out of all the magnificent, terrifying, and awe-inspiring names available, names like the Subduer, the Almighty, the Bringer of Death, the Reckoner, why did God choose Rahman and Rahim, the Compassionate and the Merciful, as his primary business card?
God's business card. I love that phrasing. It's the introduction you hand across the table before the other person knows anything else about your operation.
Right. He chose to project love and mercy through the filter first. He deliberately leads with the most accessible, the most nurturing aspects of his essence.
Because if the ultimate purpose was just to overwhelm humanity, he could have led with absolute dominance.
Or wrath. By leading with compassion, the speaker argues, it proves that the filter, the perde, is not designed to keep humanity locked out in the dark. It is explicitly designed for connection. It's tailored to human capacity.
So our entire capacity to understand anything bigger than ourselves depends on things being filtered, scaled down, and explicitly bounded.
Yes.
That feels like it sets up the next major philosophical argument this speaker makes, because he takes this cosmic idea that we can only handle a filtered reality, and he turns it into a fundamental ground-level rule of human psychology and daily perception.
He does. He introduces an aphorism that sounds deceptively simple on the surface but contains incredible philosophical depth.
What's the phrase?
He says, to see is to limit. In Turkish, görmek sınır lamaktır. And he extends this logic to say, to know is to limit.
To see is to limit. And that feels deeply counterintuitive at first glance.
Why's that?
Because we normally associate seeing with expansion. If I climb to the top of a mountain, I see more, my horizons widen, my perspective grows. How does the act of seeing equate to limiting?
It's a profound paradox of cognitive science, really. Let's break down the mechanics of perception.
Okay, let's do it.
Imagine you walk into an incredibly cluttered, detailed antique shop.
Oh, I've been in plenty of those.
Right. Now, if your eyes and your brain try to assign equal conscious weight to absolutely everything in that room at exactly the same microsecond,
Oh boy.
every title on every spine of every book, the intricate weave of the Persian rug, the dust motes catching the light, the exact grain of the wood on a chair, you would process absolutely nothing.
It would just be pure visual noise.
Pure noise, a chaotic blur. To actually see a specific object, say a brass compass on a table, your brain must perform an act of violent exclusion.
Violent exclusion.
Yes, you have to draw a distinct mental boundary around that compass. You have to actively suppress and ignore the table, the shadows, the wall behind it. You must exclude 99.9% of the visual information available to you just to focus on one object.
So by drawing a box around something, I am limiting it so my brain can actually chew on it. I have to separate the signal from the infinite noise.
Exactly. Therefore, human sight, and by extension all human knowledge, is inherently reliant on drawing boundaries. You only know a thing by defining what it is isolated from.
That makes perfect sense when you frame it like a camera lens focusing. The background has to get blurry for this subject to be sharp.
Exactly. And from this neurological reality, the speaker draws a massive theological conclusion.
Which is?
Anyone, whether a mystic, a scholar, or a philosopher claiming to see everything, or to possess absolute, unlimited, comprehensive knowledge, is fundamentally misunderstanding how human hardware operates.
They are basically lying to themselves.
They are arrogant, and they are overstepping the bounds of their own biology. We are strictly designed to operate within limits. To be finite is to be bounded.
So when we look toward the divine, we have to embrace the humbling reality that our knowledge of it is entirely bounded by our capacity to perceive.
Precisely. And the speaker backs this philosophical point up with a truly wild medical anecdote from the sources.
Yeah, the German railway worker.
Yes.
This part was fascinating. So according to the lecture, this historical worker suffered a very specific, bizarre, traumatic brain injury. A flying pebble or a piece of gravel struck his head with enough force to pierce the skull and damage a highly specific sector of his brain's cortex.
Right.
And the result wasn't a standard loss of motor skills or blindness. The injury somehow severed his brain's ability to process cause and effect relationships.
The neurological chain of A causes B was completely obliterated in his mind.
And the consequence of losing that specific cognitive function was devastating. The speaker notes that the man didn't just become confused about physics. He lost all capacity for emotion, for belief, for love, for joy, for sorrow.
He was completely hollowed out.
He was physically alive, his heart was beating, he could breathe, but the internal architecture of what we consider a human soul completely collapsed.
And the speaker explains exactly why that happened. Because every single emotion and belief we hold is predicated on connecting things in a chain of causality.
Right, like I love someone because they showed me kindness.
Exactly. I am grieving because I lost someone important. If your brain cannot link the cause to the effect, the emotion literally never generates. You become an empty vessel.
That's terrifying, honestly. But how does the speaker use this medical anomaly?
He uses it to build a sweeping thesis about the nature of faith itself. He connects this neurological necessity directly to the Islamic concept of the fitrat, the innate baseline human nature or original disposition.
Okay, the hardwiring.
Right. He argues that the human mind is hardwired at a biological and spiritual level to relentlessly seek out cause and effect. It is the core operating system of a healthy brain.
So we are constantly looking for the why.
Always. And he posits that if you follow this logical chain of cause and effect far enough, if you look at the universe and keep asking, what caused this? And what caused the thing that caused this?
The ultimate regression.
Right. This relentless, natural, logical chain inevitably, unavoidably leads the human mind to a pre-knowledge of a first cause. It leads inherently to the concept of a creator.
So he is arguing that faith isn't some mystical, irrational leap into the dark against the protests of logic. He's saying faith is the ultimate, unavoidable conclusion of a healthy, functioning, cause and effect seeking brain.
That is his exact argument. He frames faith not as a cultural accessory or an emotional crutch, but as the natural baseline output of human cognition.
Wow.
And this brings us to how he addresses the concept of disbelief or atheism, which is referred to as kufur in the text.
Now, remembering our role as neutral observers here, it's important to unpack the mechanics of his argument on this.
Absolutely. The speaker does not frame atheism as an alternative, equally valid, objective conclusion reached through neutral observation. Instead, he defines it as a negative prejudice.
A negative prejudice. I mean, calling atheism a prejudice feels like a massive leap. How does he justify making that philosophical jump?
He argues that the attempt to deny a first cause is an unnatural attempt to prove a void. It is the mind trying to assert that nothing exists in the exact place where its own hardwiring naturally expects something.
So it's like a cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. He suggests that maintaining this negation requires actively fighting against the mind's own futrat. In his view, trying to sustain this constant denial ultimately empties a person's inner self, leading to an existential hollow.
Much like the railway worker who lost his emotional capacity.
That's the exact parallel he's drawing. The deep philosophical stance he is taking here involves the concept of objectivity. He is stating that true, sterile objectivity before the infinite is impossible for a limited human being.
Because we're inside the system.
Right. You cannot stand outside the universe to judge it neutrally. You are always wearing a lens. You either approach existence with the pre-knowledge of faith, which he sees as the natural alignment with how the brain works, or you approach it with the prejudice of active denial.
That is a very stark, uncompromising binary.
It is.
He's essentially saying since you are a finite being, you are trapped in a subjective experience. It's just a question of whether your subjective lens is tuned to see the connections or tuned to stubbornly ignore them.
That's his framework, yes.
But this raises a huge, glaring practical issue for me.
What's that?
If human perception is this fragile, this limited, and we rely entirely on these filtered names of God to understand anything at all about the divine, how have everyday religious people managed to completely misunderstand and misuse these names? Because that's where the speaker turns his focus next in the source, and he pulls absolutely no punches.
He really doesn't. He aggressively pivots from abstract epistemology to a scathing, incredibly pointed critique of modern, everyday religious practice.
He goes after his own audience.
He does. Having established how magnificent and vital the names of God are for human comprehension, he targets the superficial, almost superstitious treatment of the 99 names by the general public.
What exactly is he criticizing?
He specifically targets the highly popular, widespread folkloric belief that merely memorizing and reciting the 99 names, like rattling them off like a child memorizing a multiplication table, guarantees a person entry into heaven.
Right. I found his absolute disgust with this practice fascinating. He is basically calling out his own community for treating spirituality like a video game cheat code.
A cheat code, exactly.
They know the trope. Up, up, down, down, left, right. Recite these 99 syllables in the correct order and ding, you've unlocked the paradise level.
It's the gamification of religion.
Yes. He is looking at this reduction of the infinite into a magical password and asking, are you kidding me? Why do people do this? Is it just intellectual laziness?
It stems from the deeply human desire for a guaranteed, risk-free formula for salvation. It is much, much easier to memorize a list of words than to undergo the agonizing process of moral transformation.
That makes sense. It's the path of least resistance.
But the speaker views this rote memorization as a profound insult to the depth and history of the faith. To dismantle this mindset, he offers a passionate historical defense of the prophets.
Also,
he asks his audience to seriously consider the lived reality of prophetic history. Did the prophets endure lifelong struggles? Did they face torture, exile, starvation, mockery, and grueling physical battles against polytheism, just so, centuries later, people can memorize a vocabulary list and think they've achieved ultimate salvation?
Put that way, it does sound absurd.
His answer is a resounding fiery no. If salvation were merely a matter of simple linguistic memorization, the prophets wouldn't have needed to bleed.
Okay, so if the purpose of the 99 names isn't to serve as a magical password at the gates of heaven, what is their actual functional purpose? The source outlines several specific reasons, right?
It does. The speaker systematically lists 9 specific purposes for the names, pulling them back from the realm of magic into the realm of practical theology.
Let's synthesize the main ones.
Sure. First, the names exist to build an accurate, healthy conception of God in the human mind. Because, as we discussed, we cannot comprehend the raw essence. We desperately need these names to anchor our understanding so we don't accidentally invent false gods out of our own flawed imaginations.
Right, they set the boundaries of what is divine.
Second, they exist to force humans to internalize the massive, unbridgeable qualitative difference between the creator and the creation. It is a constant, humbling reminder of our own limits.
And the most important point, which really feels like the absolute beating heart of his entire lecture, is that the names are meant to be actively reflected in human behavior.
Yeah.
It is entirely about the morality of the names.
This is the crux of his argument. This is where he demands actual effort from the believer.
What does that look like in practice?
If you stand in prayer and acknowledge that God is Ar-Rahman, the compassionate, and Ar-Rahim, the merciful, the religious requirement is not that you simply repeat those syllables 1,000 times a day on a string of beads.
Right.
The requirement is that you must practice compassion. You must be merciful to the people in your home, your workplace, and your society.
You have to embody it.
Exactly. If you recite that one of the names is the just, you must act with rigorous justice in your business dealings and personal conflicts. To memorize the name without manifesting its corresponding morality in your daily life is, in his view, completely missing the point of the religion.
It renders the entire exercise empty.
Empty, bordering on hypocrisy.
It's the difference between memorizing the recipe for a loaf of bread and actually baking the bread to feed a starving person.
That's a perfect analogy.
Knowing the exact measurements of flour in use doesn't make you a baker if you never turn on the oven.
Exactly.
This intense, relentless focus on meaning over mindless repetition, on tangible action over just verbal performance, it bleeds so perfectly into the next phase of the source material.
The Q&A.
Yes, the lecture transitions into an audience Q&A session, and we get to see the speaker take this exact same fierce, practical logic and apply it to the daily, physical, mundane rituals of Islam.
The Q&A segment is incredibly revealing because it demonstrates how his lofty, abstract philosophy touches the dirt-level details of a believer's life. He actively works to demystify practices that millions of people perform daily out of sheer habit, often without ever asking why.
Give us an example.
A perfect example is his spontaneous answer regarding the sajda, the physical act of prostration during the daily prayers.
Right. A member of the audience asks a seemingly simple, almost technical question. Why do Muslims prostrate twice in a single cycle of prayer instead of just once or 3 times? Why exactly 2?
Right. Why that specific number?
Now, given the historical weight of Islamic jurisprudence, you might expect a very dry, legalistic answer full of citations about historical precedent.
Because the Prophet did it, right?
Exactly. But his answer bypasses the legalism entirely and offers a deeply psychological, surprisingly beautiful interpretation.
He offers a psychological reading of the human soul's interaction with the divine command. He says the first prostration is an act of pure, unadulterated obedience. God commanded you to bow, so you bow.
It's a fundamental acknowledgement of authority.
Authority, submission, and humility. But the second prostration, he interprets that as an involuntary, overwhelming reaction of love and awe.
That's beautiful.
It's as if the soul, having tasted the profound closeness and peace of that first obedient bow, says, that felt so incredibly good, I couldn't stop myself from going back down and doing it again entirely voluntarily.
I did the first one because I was commanded. I did the second one because I fell in love with the feeling.
Exactly.
That framing completely transforms how you view a mechanical, repetitive movement. It injects a massive dose of emotion and agency into the ritual.
It makes it alive.
And speaking of raw emotion, the Q&A moves on to discuss another specific type of prayer, the Qunut, which grounds the discussion in a very raw, very real-world context.
He makes a sharp, necessary distinction between the standard everyday prayers and what is known in Islamic jurisprudence as the nazila qunut.
What makes it different?
The nazila is a very specific, rare prayer of supplication that is only invoked during states of extreme emergency, catastrophic disaster, or deep collective trauma. It is a communal cry for help when the normal order of the world has completely broken down.
And the context provided in the source for this is so vivid and visceral. The speaker had recently led a nazila qunut at the famous Sultan Ahmet Mosque in Istanbul, commonly known as the Blue Mosque.
Right.
And he wasn't just performing historical reenactment. It was dedicated to the intense, ongoing suffering happening in Gaza.
Yeah.
The description in the text paints an incredible, haunting picture. It's a freezing cold January at dawn. It's pitch black outside. The wind is biting. And yet, this massive historic mosque, which holds thousands of people, is completely overflowing.
Packed to the brim.
There are thousands more standing shoulder to shoulder outside in the freezing courtyard. And the speaker notes that everyone, from the leading imams down to the people shivering in the back, were weeping openly.
That scene illustrates his core point about the true function of ritual perfectly. The ritual of the qunut in that freezing courtyard wasn't a rote recitation to check off a daily religious obligation. It was a necessary vehicle for collective grief.
It was functional.
Highly functional. It was the community utilizing the ancient structure of their religion to process a very real, very acute geopolitical trauma that they otherwise had no control over.
Right.
He emphasizes that this kind of prayer isn't something you do every day just to maintain a habit. You deploy it when the communal pain is at its absolute peak. It is religion functioning as a deeply pragmatic emotional release valve and a unified statement of solidarity.
We see him being intensely practical about the emotional utility of prayer. But then the Q&A takes a fascinating left turn into the realm of household economics, and his pragmatism shines even brighter.
This is a great section.
A woman in the audience asks a very specific, highly practical question about daily life. She wants to know if she is allowed to give charity known as infaq from the household money without getting her husband's explicit permission every single time she wants to donate.
Which is a very common question in these settings.
Right. And in many highly traditional patriarchal interpretations of religious law, the reflex answer might be, no, the husband is the sole financial provider and controller. You must ask his permission. How does the speaker navigate this?
He bypasses the traditional patriarchal assumptions entirely. He fiercely defends the woman's financial autonomy within the structure of the household.
Wow.
And he argues using a very modern economic logic. He states that if a husband allocates a budget to his wife to manage the household, say, funds for groceries, utilities, and the general upkeep of the home, the moment that money is handed over for the household's function, she becomes the sovereign executive manager of those funds.
The CFO of the house.
Exactly. If she decides to be frugal, if she shops smart, cooks efficiently, manages resources well, and creates a surplus from that budget, that saved money is entirely hers to do with as she sees it.
She generated the profit.
She has the absolute, unquestionable right to distribute it to charity without seeking anyone's permission.
I have to admit, I was surprised by this progressive economic take inside such a traditional framework.
Yeah.
He is basically looking at a modern marriage and defining it as a true joint stock company.
That's exactly what it is.
The wife is a managing partner. She is not a low-level hourly employee who has to go to the CEO husband to get a requisition form co-signed for every single minor transaction.
Right.
And he makes a crucial point to say that even if she is a stay-at-home mother with no external income, her unseen, uncompensated labor, the cooking, the cleaning, the invisible mental load of raising the children is precisely what generates her equity in that household.
Sweat equity.
Her sweat equity earns her absolute ownership rights over that shared budget.
It is a profoundly empowering interpretation of domestic economics. And he even goes so far as to lightly chide husbands who might complain about this arrangement.
Though he calls them out.
He does. He essentially tells them she is doing good deeds and accruing spiritual reward with the money she generated through her own effort and frugality. You should be grateful and happy for her, not demanding receipts like an auditor.
That's amazing.
He completely strips away the cultural patriarchy that so often masquerades as divine religious law in these domestic scenarios.
And this willingness to look logically at household finances, to cut through layers of cultural assumptions and examine the functional, practical reality. It translates directly into an even bolder willingness to question massive, centuries-old religious dogmas.
Yes, we are entering the territory where he begins to actively challenge historical dogma.
Because the speaker shifts away from the domestic sphere and wades into some highly controversial, deep academic waters.
Particularly regarding the theological concept of wasila, or intercession.
Let's define intercession clearly for the listener.
Yeah.
In this religious context, intercession is the idea of praying through someone else.
Right.
It's the practice of asking a holy figure, a saint or a prophet who has passed away, to take your prayer to God on your behalf, operating on the assumption that they have VIP access to the divine that you, a regular sinner, do not possess.
Exactly. And the speaker uses rigorous historical evidence from the earliest days of Islam to aggressively challenge the practice of seeking intercession from deceased figures, including the prophet himself.
That has to ruffle some feathers.
Oh, absolutely. He knows this is controversial, so he doesn't just offer his own modern opinion. He brings in heavyweights of Islamic jurisprudence to support his thesis.
Who does he cite?
For example, he cites Imam Abu Hanifa, the towering 8th century scholar and founder of one of the 4 major Sunni schools of law. He points out that Abu Hanifa explicitly and categorically rejected the practice of turning toward the prophet's grave during prayer to ask for favors or intervention.
Wow. Categorically rejected.
Yes. According to Abu Hanifa, you face the Qibla and you direct your prayer exclusively and directly to God. No middleman.
To drive the point home, he brings up an incredible, very grounding historical anecdote about the Caliph Umar.
He recounts a famous historical incident that occurred during a severe, life-threatening drought in Medina years after the prophet had passed away. The community was desperate. Crops were failing. Animals were dying. Caliph Umar, who was one of the prophet's closest companions, did not go to the prophet's grave to ask the prophet to magically intervene and bring rain.
Which you might expect him to do, given the desperation.
Right. But instead, Umar went to the prophet's living uncle, Abbas. And Umar stood before the community and prayed, "O God, we used to ask your prophet to pray for us when he was alive among us. Now he has passed on to you, so we ask his uncle, who is alive and standing here among us, to pray for us."
That is a profound shift.
The speaker uses this historical moment to prove a foundational point. In the early, uncorrupted generations of Islam, intercession wasn't a mystical seance. It was something you requested from the living.
Pious community members.
Right. People who could actually stand shoulder to shoulder with you, raise their hands, and join their voices with yours. You ask the living, not the dead.
There's another detail the source mentions regarding this exact topic that completely blew my mind. And it's about Aisha, the prophet's wife, and how she intentionally changed the grammar of a daily prayer.
Yes.
Why does a pronoun matter so much in this context?
It matters because of the absolute fragility of Tawhid, the strict monotheism at the heart of Islam. The human mind has a very slippery psychological slope toward idolatry over generations.
Right.
The specific prayer in question is the At-Tahiyat, which is recited while sitting during the daily prayers. The speaker notes that while the prophet was alive, the phrase commonly used by his followers was, "Peace be upon you, O prophet," using the second person direct address.
Because he was physically there.
Exactly. But after the prophet passed away, Aisha, who was not just his wife, but a profound, fiercely intelligent scholar in her own right, consciously altered the grammar she used. She began saying, "Peace be upon the prophet," switching to the third person.
Wow. Just a tiny shift, but huge implications.
Because logically and linguistically, you only say "you" to someone who is currently physically present in the room to hear it. Once he was gone, she adjusted the language to reflect the harsh reality of death.
She refused to blur the lines.
The speaker highlights this tiny grammatical shift to show how incredibly precise, how fiercely logical the early generations were about avoiding anything that blurred the lines between the living and the dead, or the human and the divine. They knew that talking to the dead like they were alive was the first step toward worshiping them.
This guy's logic is just relentless.
It is.
And he applies that same cold, hard logic to how people attempt to manage their daily prayers and obligations. He critiques this bizarre loophole some sects try to use to get out of religious debt.
The combined intentions loophole.
Yes. The source talks about individuals who have years, sometimes decades, of missed mandatory prayers, the fard prayers they simply neglected to do. But instead of undertaking the difficult task of making those up, they spend all their time performing extra voluntary prayers, the nay for sunnah prayers.
Which are easier.
Right. And some of these people try to use a mental loophole. They say, well, I'll just intend to do both at the same time. I'll pray this voluntary prayer, but in my heart I'll intend for it to magically count as my missed mandatory prayer. He completely mocks this idea, doesn't he?
He finds it intellectually bankrupt. He deconstructs the concept of intention naya in Islamic jurisprudence. Intention isn't some magical thought bubble that can bend reality. It means having a specific, singular, focused purpose behind an action.
You can't double dip.
He argues that you cannot simultaneously intend to perform a purely voluntary act of devotion and pay off a mandatory binding debt with the exact same physical action.
The economic analogy he uses is brilliant.
It is. He says, if you owe the bank $1,000 in mandatory debt, you cannot walk into the lobby, hand the teller $50 and say, I intend for this to be a voluntary, generous gift to the staff, but also please put it toward my principal.
The bank manager would laugh you out of the building.
The mandatory debt must be paid first, explicitly. He is demanding fundamental intellectual honesty in how believers approach their obligations to the divine.
Okay, but all of this, the critique of intercession, the grammar lessons, the bank analogies, all of it is just a warm-up for what is undoubtedly the most radical, explosive academic point in his entire lecture.
The Hadith Qudsi.
He takes direct aim at a massive, revered category of religious texts.
This is indeed a massive academic bombshell for his audience. It strikes at the very foundations of traditional textual reliance.
Let's provide the necessary context for the listener. What are hadiths?
Hadiths are the collected, recorded accounts of the sayings, actions, and silent approvals of the Prophet Muhammad. They form a vast ocean of text that guides much of Islamic law and daily life.
But within that vast ocean, there's a special, highly elevated subcategory called Hadith Qudsi, or sacred hadiths.
Right.
These are specific sayings where the prophet is quoted as saying, God said. They're essentially quotes attributed directly to God, but they are not found within the pages of the Quran itself.
They are treated by many millions of people as this ultra-sacred, unquestionable secondary level of divine revelation.
And the speaker looks at this entire categorization and completely rejects its validity.
Entirely.
He argues from a purely historical standpoint that this specific label, Hadith Qudsi, did not exist during the lifetime of the prophet. It did not exist during the time of his companions, nor the generation after them.
It's a later invention.
He points out that the famous scholar, Imam Shafi'i, invented this category much later in history.
And to understand why Shafi'i might have done this, you have to look at the historical context of the 8th and 9th centuries.
What was happening then?
The Islamic Empire was expanding rapidly, absorbing different cultures, and countless different sects and legal schools were proliferating. There was a desperate, pressing need to systematize and categorize the exploding volume of religious texts to prevent legal chaos.
They needed a filing system.
Exactly. Imam Shafi'i was trying to build a coherent legal framework, and categorizing these specific types of sayings was part of that administrative effort.
So he's saying Imam Shafi'i was doing filing and administrative work, trying to organize the massive library of texts, but over the centuries, people mistook the filing system for divine reality.
That's his argument.
He is telling his audience that just because a piece of ancient paper has the words God said written on it, you do not automatically turn off your critical thinking. You do not just bow down to the text in blind reverence.
Right.
He argues that you have to subject these supposedly divine quotes to the exact same rigorous, ruthless historical peer review process as any other mundane historical document.
Precisely. That peer review process is known as survey tadil, the meticulous Islamic science of evaluating the reliability of the human narrators in the chain of transmission.
So it's about auditing the people who pass the story along.
Yes. Who exactly said it? Were they known in their community, to be honest? Did they have a good memory? Or were they known to be forgetful? Did they actually live in the same city at the same time as the person they claimed to be quoting?
It's forensic history.
It is. The speaker is insisting, forcefully, that a text cannot magically bypass this strict vetting process just by slapping the claim God said on it.
Right.
If the chain of human narrators is weak, if there is a known liar or someone with a failing memory in that chain, the text is weak, regardless of how holy, majestic, or comforting the words themselves might sound.
He is essentially begging people to critically review supposedly divine quotes. He's saying, do not let the holy packaging stop you from checking the expiration date.
That's a great way to summarize it.
Which bridges us perfectly to the final major theme of the source material. Having deconstructed intercession and torn down unquestioned textual categories, he turns his analytical sights on how modern believers actually talk about the Prophet Muhammad today.
The natural progression.
Right, because if we apply this ruthless historical logic to the texts, it completely changes how we should look at the way humans talk about the Prophet himself. If we strip away the mystical fluff, what are we left with?
He identifies two extremely toxic opposite extremes in how the Prophet is treated by modern believers.
What are the terms?
He utilizes the traditional terms ifrat, which means severe exaggeration or going much too far, and tefrit, which means severe underestimation, neglect, or not going far enough.
And he focuses on the exaggeration, right?
Yes. He spends the bulk of his energy taking direct aim at the ifrat. He heavily criticizes the modern, widespread practice of attaching half-page-long, incredibly elaborate, intensely flowery titles like Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and many other extended variations every single time the Prophet's name is mentioned in writing or speech.
And he makes a really fascinating historical point to back this up. He notes that if you actually go back and look at the earliest physical Islamic texts, the documents written by the people who actually lived with him, ate with him, fought alongside him, or shortly after him, they simply didn't do this.
They just wrote his name.
Exactly. This practice of attaching massive paragraphs of mandatory praise to his name didn't become standard, expected practice until 300 years after his death.
It is a critical historical observation that forces the audience to confront their own traditions. And his psychological analysis of why this linguistic inflation happened 300 years later is utterly devastating.
Devastating how?
He views these excessive titles not as a sign of deep love, but as a kind of psychological and spiritual bribe.
A bribe. How does reverence morph into a bribe and eventually into idolatry?
He argues that the earliest generations showed their profound reverence for the Prophet by actually doing the agonizingly difficult work of living up to his moral example.
They walk the walk.
Right. They emulated his strict justice, his physical courage, his boundless compassion for the poor. But as the centuries passed, as empires grew wealthy and complacent, later generations found it too difficult, too personally demanding to actually live that rigorous moral life.
It's hard work.
It is. So because they collectively failed to emulate his actions, they tried to overcompensate with their words. They tried to cover up their glaring moral failures by giving him increasingly grandiose, almost supernatural titles.
They heaped praise upon praise.
They almost elevated him to the level of a demigod. And the speaker points out that this overcompensation dangerously borders on violating Tawhid, the strict, uncompromising monotheism that is the absolute non-negotiable core of Islam.
He is basically saying, you are failing the class, you haven't done the reading, you failed the midterm, so you are buying the teacher an incredibly expensive, shiny apple to make up for it.
Yes.
And he specifically calls out certain popular prayers to illustrate how dangerous this trajectory is. The source mentions a specific prayer called the Salata Tafriche.
The Salata Tafriche is a very popular, albeit historically later, supplication recited in times of distress.
What's the issue with it?
He heavily criticizes the actual language and framing of this prayer because it essentially claims that the Prophet himself is the one who solves all earthly problems, cures all physical illnesses, and miraculously unties all the knots of hardship in a person's life.
He gives him divine powers.
Exactly. The speaker forcefully argues that attributing this kind of omnipotent, divine problem-solving power to a human being, even the most revered prophet, is a massive theological error.
Right.
The prophet is a guide. He is a messenger. He is a mortal human being who suffered and died. God alone is the ultimate solver of problems. To blur that fundamental line with excessive, desperate praise is to lose the plot of the religion entirely.
So if you strip away all the half-page titles, if you throw out the performative overcompensation and the magical thinking,
right,
what does sincere respect actually look like in his view?
The speaker's ultimate point is that sincere respect isn't about engaging in linguistic gymnastics or competing to see who can use the most adjectives. Reverence is highly contextual and deeply personal.
Contextual how?
He argues that there are absolutely times when you are in a formal setting, perhaps giving a public lecture or a sermon, where it is entirely appropriate and respectful to use the formal title, the Messenger of God.
Makes sense.
But he also insists there are other times, in moments of deep personal reflection, historical study, or emotional connection, where it is entirely appropriate and beautifully sincere to just say Muhammad with the genuine warmth, love, and intimacy you would use for a close, dear friend.
because he was a person.
Exactly. True reverence isn't measured by word count or formal titles. It's measured by raw sincerity and actual alignment with the moral weight of his message.
Which perfectly encapsulates the entire arc of this incredible, dense lecture. If we pull back and look at everything we've unpacked today, there's a very clear, unbroken through line.
What stands out to you?
From the two bows, representing the cosmic, terrifyingly intense closeness of revelation, to understanding the beautiful names of God, not as magic spell words, but as a vital spiritual ozone layer that protects us while teaching us how to act, to the realization that true faith requires rigorous, unyielding, critical thinking, not just memorizing cheat codes or accepting centuries of historical dogma blindly. He is demanding that believers strip away the heavy cultural baggage, the performative religion, and the rote habits, and engage with the divine with absolute, terrifying sincerity.
It is a profound, challenging call to intellectual and moral awakening. He is asking his audience, and by extension anyone analyzing this text, to stop hiding behind comfortable rituals and flowery titles and to start carrying the actual weight of lived morality.
It's a heavy lift.
It is. He forces the listener to confront the harsh reality of their own cognitive limitations, but then challenges them to use those very limitations not as an excuse for ignorance, but as the exact framework through which they can safely glimpse the infinite.
And speaking of limitations, that brings us to the end of our deep dive today, but I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to chew on. We spent a lot of time discussing the speaker's core aphorism, to see is to limit. We explored how the human brain can only understand something infinite by drawing a box around it, by intentionally defining its boundaries and ignoring the rest.
Right.
But I want you to apply that logic inward. What does that mean for how you look at yourself? Think about it. We constantly define ourselves. We define ourselves by our current jobs, by our past mistakes, by the social labels we eagerly put on or have forced upon us, by the specific roles we play in our families.
We box ourselves in.
Exactly. We draw tiny, restrictive boxes around our own identities every single day just to make sense of who we are. But if seeing is limiting, every time you definitively label yourself, are you actually blinding yourself to your own infinite potential?
That's a powerful question.
In your desperate, entirely human attempt to understand who you are right now, are you trapping your own true essence behind a screen, a per day, of your own making? It's something to think about the next time you look in the mirror and think you know exactly who is looking back. Thank you for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive. We hope it gave you something genuinely new to ponder. And as always, keep questioning the world around you.
Welcome to The Critique. Today's material is a profound theological lecture exploring divine revelation and the Esma-ul Husna, the beautiful names of Allah, followed by an extensive session of practical Q&A. The current transition between the profound theological exposition on the Esma-ul Husna and the subsequent audience Q&A abruptly fractures the thematic unity of the discourse.
Yeah, it really, really does. I mean, the material spends its entire first half doing this incredibly delicate heavy lifting, you know? It gets the audience into a very specific state of mind.
Exactly. The imagery used early on is just stunning. Like, we are guided through this whole concept of the divine names acting as a protective filter.
Right, like an atmosphere or a curtain.
Yeah, a curtain. And the speaker argues that without this filter, the raw, unfiltered reality of the creator would quite literally burn the created.
It's an intense image.
It is. And we're taken on this journey to the Sidrat al-Muntaha, exploring how the human act of seeing is inherently an act of limiting. It's highly meditative, you know? You really feel the weight of it.
Absolutely.
But then, without any warning at all, the lecture just halts. Like, we drop directly into these logistical, administrative questions about website updates for Hasbi Halar.
Yeah, and then straight into highly pedantic fiqh inquiries, right? Like why there are 2 prostrations in a specific prayer instead of 3.
Right, and I understand the speaker is trying to address the audience's immediate needs, but I have to wonder, could this stark contrast actually be an intentional, grounded choice?
How do you mean?
Well, isn't there some value in pulling the audience from the heavens back down to the gritty realities of daily practice, like a deliberate splash of cold water to wake them up?
I mean, I hear that argument. Grounding theology in reality is definitely essential. But we have to look at the execution here and the cognitive whiplash it creates for the listener.
The whiplash.
Yeah. So the weakness here is that the structural break is simply too jarring.
and it derails the spiritual momentum that the speaker worked so hard to build.
It just cuts it off.
Completely. The listener is ripped from a deeply reflective state regarding the infinite and the nature of perception straight into a debate about administrative website delays and mechanical prayer counts. And there's no conceptual bridge at all.
Right, it's just 0 to 60. Or, I guess, 60 to 0.
Exactly. The human mind simply cannot recalibrate that quickly from the celestial to the clerical. It makes the piece feel like two entirely separate audio recordings accidentally spliced together, rather than a cohesive theological journey.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. So the Q&A shouldn't feel like a break from the lecture. It needs to be the applied continuation of it. Theology in action, basically.
Precisely. So, since the absence of a bridge is the weakness, the suggestion here is to architect a thematic bridge that explicitly connects the practical Q&A back to the core lesson of the divine names.
Okay, let me throw an example from the text at you to see how we could actually apply this.
Sure, go for it.
So there's a moment where a listener asks about the Kunut prayer for Gaza at the Sultan Ahmed Mosque.
Right, I remember that part.
Yeah, and right now the speaker just launches into this highly technical jurisprudential distinction between a standard Witr Kunut and the Mun Kunut, which is the prayer for extraordinary circumstances.
And look, while that fic distinction is accurate, delivering it dryly completely abandons the preceding hour of theology.
So how do we fix it?
To build that bridge, the concrete suggestion is to explicitly tie this extraordinary circumstance prayer back to invoking specific divine names of mercy or justice that the speaker literally just finished discussing.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that connects it perfectly.
Right? The speaker could frame the Mun Kunut as the ultimate human act of reaching through the atmosphere of the Esma-ul Husna during times of unbearable worldly suffering.
That's so much more powerful. By asking the audience to consider which names they are calling upon when praying for Gaza, you take a geopolitical tragedy and a technical prayer ruling, and you weave them directly into the theological premise.
Exactly. It keeps the listener anchored to the actual topic.
There's another great spot for this integration, actually. Later in the text, the discussion turns to salavat, sending blessings upon the prophet.
Oh, yeah. The question about doing it without falling into extremes?
Right, what the text calls ifrat and tefrit, meaning over-exaggeration or underappreciation. The speaker goes off on the historical inflation of these formulas, like the Salat Tefrikiya, warning people not to treat them like magic spells or bribes.
And the perfect bridge there is to connect that exact warning back to the speaker's earlier critique about treating the Esma-ul Husna as a rote transactional password to heaven.
Oh, because they're basically doing the same thing.
Yes. Earlier, the speaker brilliantly pointed out the absurdity of memorizing the Esma-ul Husna without understanding the meaning. The concrete suggestion here is to show how the mechanical, unthinking repetition of salawat suffers from the exact same spiritual emptiness.
So you just draw a direct parallel.
Exactly. Show the audience that whether it is the Isma or the salawat, treating the divine relationship like a transactional vending machine undermines the entire foundation of faith. By drawing that parallel, the Q&A becomes a mirror reflecting the main lecture.
That is such a smart fix, and that actually bleeds perfectly into our second major issue, which is entirely about how the speaker handles the audience during these interactions. The tonal shift from the reverent, awe-inspiring discussion of divine revelation to the frequently exasperated responses during the Q&A undermines the speaker's authoritative empathy.
The contrast in persona there is really, really striking.
It is. The material establishes this incredibly beautiful, mystical tone early on. The speaker's delivering these gorgeous aphorisms like, to see is to limit, and to know everything is to know nothing.
Yeah, it positions them as a deeply reflective, wise guide.
But then, the moment the Q&A starts, the speaker becomes visibly frustrated, like they sigh audibly.
Yeah, you can practically hear them rolling their eyes.
Right. The material shows them saying things like, Hala bumi yoruldum yahu, which translates to, are we still on this? I'm tired of this man, when asked about combining intentions for mist and sunnah prayers.
It's quite dismissive.
It really is. The speaker even sarcastically asks if the questioners are from Kayseri, implying they're trying to bargain or get a 2-for-1 deal on their prayers.
Wow. Yeah, that's rough.
But, I have to challenge this slightly.
because I think audiences actually crave that raw, unfiltered passion sometimes. Don't we risk turning a charismatic speaker into a sanitized, boring academic if we smooth out this frustration?
Look, authenticity is magnetic. There is no denying that. But we have to distinguish between passionate authenticity and defensive exasperation.
Okay, fair distinction.
The weakness here is that this specific brand of exasperation alienates the very audience the speaker is trying to elevate. It abruptly shifts the persona from a wise, compassionate theological guide to like an impatient school teacher dealing with unruly students.
Yeah, it breaks that trust.
Completely. And this defensive posture directly undercuts the earlier, profound message about understanding faith beyond mere prejudice, or kufr. When a speaker sighs and expresses fatigue at an audience's genuine, albeit basic questions, it breaks the emotional safety of the room.
Right, because then the listeners instinctively tense up, wondering if they too are foolish for not knowing the answers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They stop engaging.
So you're saying the raw emotion is fine, but the target of the emotion is counterproductive.
Exactly. The suggestion here is to recalibrate the Q&A responses to maintain the role of an empathetic guide. Instead of expressing overt irritation, the speaker should use the audience's pedantic or repetitive questions as teachable moments regarding human nature itself.
So we want to harness that raw conversational energy, but direct it toward compassionate enlightenment rather than exasperation.
You got it.
Okay, let's drill down into that specific question about the intention for make-up prayers, the kaza, versus voluntary, nafali prayers. How do we handle that without the heavy sigh?
Well, I would look at it from the perspective of human anxiety. Instead of the expression of exhaustion, replace it with a gentle observational pivot.
What would that sound like?
For instance, the speaker could say, "You know, this recurring question highlights something fascinating about us. It shows how we often get trapped in the anxiety of spiritual accounting, trying to balance our spreadsheets of fars and nafil, rather than simply standing in the presence of Allah."
Oh, I love that approach. You validate the underlying anxiety rather than mocking the manifestation of it.
Exactly. You don't shame them for asking.
Right. You elevate a mundane fiqh question into a profound psychological observation. It honors the question, gently guides the audience away from their rigid legalism, and completely preserves the speaker's status as a wise mentor.
It's a win-win.
And you can apply that same compassionate pivot to the section discussing the historical expansion of Salavat formulas, right?
Definitely.
Because there, the speaker gets quite heated, essentially asking if the audience's ears even hear what their mouths are saying, and accusing them of using these formulas to solve all their earthly problems.
Yeah, the intellectual boundary the speaker is drawing there is correct, but the emotional delivery is just way too harsh.
So how do we reframe that one?
Well, framing is everything there. The concrete suggestion is to frame the correction as a protective love for the Prophet's true legacy, rather than mocking the questioner's background or understanding.
So it's about shifting the motivation behind the passion.
Right. For example, instead of berating the practice as absurd, the speaker could lean into that passion and say, "I speak strongly on this because I want to protect the pure, unadulterated relationship the Prophet meant for us to have with the divine. When we clutter it with endless transactional formulas, we lose the very essence of his teaching."
Wow. That maintains the intellectual rigor and the passion we talked about earlier, but the tone is rooted in love and protection, not annoyance. It's so much more effective.
It really softens the blow while still making a firm point.
Okay, so moving from the tone of the Q&A back to the structure of the lecture itself, the foundational list of the 9 reasons for studying the Esma-ul Husna lacks sufficient practical elaboration, leaving a critical theological framework feeling rushed and theoretical.
Yeah, this part of the transcript just felt like a massive missed opportunity to really land the plane.
It did. Right before the Q&A begins, the material introduces this powerful 9-point framework explaining exactly why the names of Allah matter.
Which is the core of the whole talk.
Exactly. We're talking about massive concepts here. Building a correct conception of God, understanding the ontological difference between creator and created, reflecting the morals of the names in human behavior. It is a brilliant synthesis of the entire lecture.
But then they just blow right past it.
They do. The speaker rapidly reads them off almost like a grocery list, just to close the section and move on to the audience interaction.
Right.
Now, given that the listener submitting this material is deeply familiar with the source, and the audience in the room is quite advanced, I'll play devil's advocate again.
Go for it.
Isn't it better to just list them quickly? Like, why bog down the pace with elaborate explanations of things they might already conceptually grasp when the highly anticipated audience interaction is waiting?
Because human memory and cognitive absorption do not function like a quick reference index, regardless of how advanced the audience is.
Okay, that's a fair point.
The weakness here is that these 9 points are the intellectual anchor of the entire presentation. They are the so what of the whole lecture. By treating them as a rapid-fire checklist, the material deprives the audience of the chance to actually internalize them.
It just washes over them.
Exactly. It renders the most important synthesis of the lecture as a rushed afterthought. When you speed through your core thesis right before a massive format change, like a Q&A, you create a profound sense of incompletion.
Right. Because the audience's brains are still trying to process point 3 while the speaker is already taking logistical questions about website updates.
The ideas just don't have time to settle. So the solution here is to restructure the pacing of the lecture to allow these 9 points to serve as the definitive climax.
But we don't want to drag it out for another hour, right?
No, you don't need to spend an extra hour on them. But the suggestion is that you must provide a brief, vivid, and practical illustration for the most vital points to ensure they resonate deeply before changing the format.
So it's about giving them weight.
Right. They need to feel like the summit of the mountain we've just climbed, not, the terms and conditions read rapidly at the end of a commercial.
That's a perfect analogy. Okay, let's look closely at how to actually do that. Let's take point 4, which is the morals of the names reflecting in human behavior.
Okay, so to execute this, the speaker shouldn't just state the point and move on. The concrete suggestion is to briefly revisit the earlier highly successful discussion of al-Basir, the all-seeing.
Oh, I remember that part.
Yeah. Earlier in the lecture, the speaker brilliantly explained that a human inherently limits their sight in order to focus, noting the aphorism that to see is to limit.
Right.
So to illustrate point 4, the speaker could take just 30 seconds to explain how adopting the moral lens of al-Basir means recognizing our own limited vision in daily life and striving to look at others with the depth and encompassing patience of the divine.
Oh, I see. By connecting the theoretical bullet point directly back to a concrete philosophical concept established earlier in the hour, the point suddenly has immense weight and texture.
Exactly. It ties the whole room together.
What about point 5? The notes say point 5 is understanding the ontological difference between creator and created. On its own, that is a terribly dry academic string of words.
It really is. And right now, it's just left hanging as a phrase. The concrete suggestion here is to explicitly re-invoke the atmosphere or curtain analogy used in the first half of the lecture.
The filter that keeps us from burning.
Exactly. When arriving at point 5, the speaker could say, "Remember the curtain we discussed earlier? Understanding this ontological difference means realizing that without the filter of the names, we, the created, would burn in the raw reality of the creator."
That's so evocative.
Right. Taking just a few moments to bring back that visceral, striking image turns a dry academic bullet point into a vivid, memorable conclusion. It locks the concept into the listener's mind permanently before opening the floor to questions.
It makes the theology tangible. So, to synthesize our discussion today, this material is undeniably rich, layered, and deeply rooted in theological expertise. It tackles complex, abstract concepts with incredibly vivid imagery.
It really does. It's fantastic material.
But to truly maximize its impact and ensure the audience absorbs the depth of the message, there are a few high-level, structural, and tonal adjustments to consider. First, the listener needs to architect a thematic thread connecting the high theology to the logistical Q&A, ensuring the practical questions operate as an applied continuation of the divine names.
Yep, bridge that gap.
Second, recalibrate the exasperated tone during the audience interactions. Transforming visible frustration into empathetic, teachable moments will maintain the speaker's authoritative, compassionate persona.
Because you don't want to alienate the room.
Exactly. And finally, give the core 9-point framework the breathing room it deserves. By restructuring the pacing to provide vivid illustrations for these points, they will truly anchor the message as the climax of the piece, rather than just a rushed checklist.
Totally agree.
We want to sincerely thank the listener for submitting this fascinating material. We invite you to apply these structural and tonal suggestions to your work, and please submit your revised piece for a future critique. We would love to see how it evolves.
Definitely send it back in.
Because ultimately, presenting profound theology shouldn't feel like being violently teleported from the serene depths of the ocean straight into a blaring traffic jam. With the right thematic bridges, a consistent empathetic tone, and deliberate pacing, you can bring the surface world down into the tranquil depths, allowing your audience to breathe, explore, and truly see the vastness of what you have to offer.
Welcome to The Debate. If you walk outside right now and try to stare directly at the sun, you'll destroy your vision.
Right, because the human eye, it simply isn't built to process that much raw, unfiltered power. To actually observe it, you need a filter. You need, like, Eclipse glasses.
Exactly. You need a screen that severely limits the light so that you can perceive the object without being completely blinded. And we accept this physical limitation without question. But today we're asking if the exact same rule applies to how human beings approach God.
It really is the ultimate human dilemma, isn't it? How does a finite mind process the infinite? Do we actually need theological eclipse glasses?
And that brings us to the core of our exchange today. We are exploring the tension between pure, strict monotheism and the inescapable human desire to categorize and, elevate. We're drawing our framework from a really fascinating lecture by Mustafa İslamoğlu on the Esma-ul Husna, the divine names of God, and how we interact with prophetic tradition.
Yeah, and the big question here is, when believers build these elaborate historical traditions to interact with the divine, are they creating necessary organic frameworks to help the human mind process all that overwhelming majesty? Or are they constructing dangerous deviations that blur the absolute line between the creator and the created?
It is a phenomenal tension, because on one hand you have the absolute transcendence of God, and on the other, the lived, messy reality of human religious experience.
Right.
And I'll be arguing that these constructed frameworks, specifically things like inventing categories of divine speech outside the Quran or writing highly exaggerated praises for the prophet, are post hoc deviations. They distort strict theological boundaries. Frankly, they edge dangerously close to attributing divine qualities to a human being, which threatens the very core of strict monotheism.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, conceptual clarity is paramount. When you blur the lines, you invite disaster.
Well, and I will be taking the opposing view. While the preservation of monotheism is obviously the foundation, treating these historical traditions as mere deviations is overly rigid. It's just reductionist.
Reductionist?
Yeah, because it tears down religious structures without stopping to appreciate the psychological mechanics of why they were built in the first place. These frameworks act as essential filters for the human mind. Dismissing them ignores the fundamental necessity of having a cognitive atmosphere, so to speak.
Well, let's test that necessity by looking at where these boundaries get blurred first. Let's look at the epistemological status of the prophet's words. Like, how do we actually know what is divine and what is human?
Sure.
There is a specific category in Islamic scholarship called the Hadith Qudsi. By traditional definition, this is a saying where the core meaning is supposedly directly from God, but the actual wording is from the prophet.
Right, and it's usually framed in the first person, like God saying, my servant does this, or I am as my servant expects me to be.
Exactly.
Which sets it apart from the Quran, which is considered the literal verbatim word of God in both meaning and wording.
Exactly. But there is a massive logical inconsistency here. These Hadith Qudsi texts are subjected to the exact same rigorous historical critique as standard, everyday sayings of the prophet. That process is called Sir Vet Tadil.
Right, the traditional vetting methodology.
And let's explain what that actually entails for a second. Sir Vet Tadil is essentially a massive, meticulous background check on every single person in the historical chain of narration.
Right.
Scholars checked for memory retention, moral character, whether the narrator's lifespans actually overlap so they could have physically met. It is a deeply human historical critique. And because of this human process, some of these supposedly divine Hadith Qudsi are graded as weak.
Yeah.
Some are even graded as outright fabricated.
That is correct. The methodology applies to them across the board.
Well, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because if a text is truly God's word, it logically cannot have a fabricated or weak grade. You cannot apply a human background check to divine dictation.
I see what you're saying, but...
I mean, if it's God's word, it's the Quran. If it can be fabricated by a human chain, it's a human text. The lecture we're examining points out that this categorization didn't even exist among the earliest companions. It was a later academic taxonomy, heavily formalized by scholars like Imam Shafi centuries later.
But wait, are you saying the prophet never uttered these words, or just that categorizing them as, like, half divine is the problem?
I'm saying the category itself is a confusing fiction. Let me offer an analogy to explain the mechanism here.
Okay.
Imagine an ordinary person narrowly survives a horrific car crash. They crawl out of the wreckage, look at the sky and say, "God told me today, be careful with the life I gave you."
Right.
If you're standing there, you don't think God audibly spoke English from the clouds.
No, of course not. You understand they are interpreting the event.
Exactly. It is the person's profound reading of the divine will through the reality they just experienced. These hadith are exactly that, the prophet's deep spiritual reading of events and divine will, translated into his own words.
Okay, but...
It is not a separate class of unassailable divine dictation. To formalize it as hadith Qudsi creates a muddy middle ground between the creator and the created that just shouldn't exist.
Well, I come at it from a different way. You are demanding a strict binary. Either it is the eternal, immutable Quran, or it is the standard, everyday advice of a human prophet telling people how to plant palm trees.
Because theologically, that binary is necessary.
But the mechanics of revelation and prophecy are not always so neatly binary. If you look closely at Surah An-Najm in the Quran, it explicitly details the intense physical proximity of revelation. It discusses the metaphor of the archangel Gabriel coming near, being, 2 bow lengths away. The phrase is kabe kafsain,
which is a brilliant Arab cultural idiom.
It really is. And to understand why that matters, you have to look at the sociology of tribal Arabia. When 2 warring tribes would finally make peace, the leaders would step forward, place their 2 bows together, and pull back the string to shoot a single arrow.
Wow.
Right? It signifies an absolute unity of purpose. It represents 0 distance.
Yes, and that explains the sheer intensity of the Quran's revelation, the perfect transmission.
But it also explains the state of the prophet. The scholars who, centuries later, created the Hadith Qudsi category were not trying to create some malicious theological contradiction. They were trying to taxonomize this exact phenomenon of extreme proximity. They looked at the historical corpus and recognized that there was a space of transmission that isn't the formalized Quran, but it carries a distinct spiritual gravity that is much heavier than the prophet's personal daily opinions.
I hear you, but...
To discard the category entirely just because it's a later invention is to flatten the profound nuance of how the infinite communicates with the finite. The scholars were simply giving a name to that space of 2 bow lengths.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. Naming that space might have been their intention, but the practical, historical result was theological confusion. By giving it a special title, they essentially created a backdoor.
A backdoor to what?
Well, texts that couldn't meet the ironclad evidentiary standard of the Quran were suddenly allowed to claim a type of divine authority.
But they didn't bypass the evidentiary standard, as you yourself noted. They still used the background checks.
True, but in the minds of the masses, calling something divine speech elevates it beyond critique. And if we accept that the words of the prophet were later elevated to quasi-divine status through these categories, it's not surprising that his personhood underwent the exact same transformation. Let's look at the evolution of the salawat, the honorifics and prayers sent upon the prophet.
Veneration is deeply personal for believers.
It is, but the historical data is striking, and we really need to look at the how and why. In the first century of Islam, you have the standard, simple prayers taught by the prophet himself, essentially asking God to bless him.
Right.
But by the 2nd and 3rd centuries, we see a geometric explosion. Suddenly, there are over 300 different, highly elaborate, intensely stylized salawat. And we need to look at one specific example to understand the danger here, the Salat al-Tafrijiyya.
The prayer of relief?
Right. If you listen to the language of this specific prayer, it claims that through the prophet, all knots are untied, all calamities are lifted, and all worldly needs are answered.
This is a massive theological violation.
I think that's a harsh reading of it.
But it directly contradicts the prophet's own explicit command. He famously told his followers, "Do not elevate me as the Christians elevated the Son of Mary. I'm a servant of God and his messenger." The prophet was aggressively vigilant about this.
Yes, he definitely was.
There's a historical account where a man used a conjunction saying, what God and you will, and the prophet scolded him immediately, saying, "Have you made me an equal to God?"
The danger of polytheism, of shirk, is real. No one is debating that the prophet guarded against it.
So when we look at these later elaborate prayers, we have to ask why they evolved. Why did believers start attributing the power to untie cosmic knots to a human being?
And your answer is?
The psychological diagnosis here is devastatingly sharp. It's essentially a bribe.
A bribe? Seriously?
Yes, a rushvet. Think about it. Living up to the prophet's actual moral standard, his strict monotheism, his physical struggle, his poverty, his ethics, that takes immense, exhausting effort.
Well, sure.
It is so much easier for a believer to abandon his living, demanding legacy, place him on a mythological pedestal, and use elaborate poetry to beg him to solve their worldly problems. We elevate him to a myth so we don't have to emulate his reality. It turns a historical exemplar into a mythical genie.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. I acknowledge the danger of blurring the lines, but you are setting up a completely false binary here.
How is it a false binary?
You're saying that either a believer follows the prophet's hard, literal example perfectly, or they are bribing him with fake honorifics. That shows a fundamental lack of understanding of historical Islamic sociology.
How so? I mean, if the language literally asks the prophet to cure an illness or solve a debt, how is that not a bribe to avoid doing the hard work of reliance on God?
Because you are ignoring the cultural marketplace these Muslims were living in. You asked why there was an explosion of 300 salawat in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Look at the map.
Okay.
As Islam rapidly expanded into Persian and Byzantine territories, Muslims encountered ancient imperial cultures. These were societies that venerated their emperors and spiritual leaders with massive page-long titles.
Right.
Muslims suddenly had to adapt their language of reverence. They were competing in a new cultural arena to articulate the majesty of their own prophet.
But adapting your theology to match Persian emperor worship is exactly the problem.
It's not emperor worship. It's the established grammar of awe. Even the framework we're discussing warns against the opposite extreme. It specifically cautions against treating the prophet casually, like an army buddy or askar karkadashi.
Well, obviously you shouldn't be casual, but
there is a recognized human need for a specialized language of reverence. Yes, classical Arabic honorifics sound exaggerated to the modern ear. Arab heads of state today are still introduced with titles that take up half a page. It demonstrates the sociological reality of language. In these cultures, elaborate honorifics are how you express deep love.
But poetry has limits when theology is on the line.
Of course it does. But these 300 salawats weren't a coordinated conspiracy to commit polytheism. They were an outpouring of affection. To clinically dismiss all of this historical poetry as a mere bribe shows a real lack of intellectual charity.
I'm not saying it's a conspiracy. I'm saying the end result is the same.
Yes, the Salat al-Tafrijiyya uses hyperbolic language about untying knots, but it is poetry, and poetry inherently uses hyperbole. If you're listening to this, you might be thinking, what's the harm in a beautiful prayer? Believers understand the mechanism perfectly well. They know the ultimate cause is God. But they are utilizing their culture's highest language of veneration to honor the human conduit of that divine grace.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. And I think this connects perfectly to the ultimate limitation of the human mind, which is where this entire debate ultimately leads.
Okay.
The human struggle to conceptualize the prophet is directly linked to our struggle to conceptualize God. And the lecture introduces a remarkably powerful philosophical aphorism, Gurmuk Sinirlorakter. To see is to limit.
It really is the epistemological core of this whole discussion.
It is. Think about how vision actually works. If you claim to see everything in a room all at once, you actually see nothing in detail. To perceive anything at all, your eye must focus.
Right.
And by focusing on one object, You blur out and exclude the rest. You limit your field of vision to make sense of reality. The argument here is that by stripping away all this limitless hyperbolic praise of the prophet, and by removing these confusing human-made categories of hadith, we are actually doing something incredibly healthy. We are accepting our cognitive limits.
So you're saying that piling on endless honorifics is a refusal to accept human limitation?
Precisely. Let's look at how the human mind naturally interacts with God. The framework talks about how humans have a primary pre-knowledge, an own bilgi, which is hardwired into our very nature, our fitra. We understand the world fundamentally through cause and effect, or sebep sonuç ilişkisi.
Oh, wait. This is where that incredible story of the German railway worker comes in.
Yes, let's unpack that because the mechanism is fascinating. At the turn of the century, there was a German railway worker who suffered a severe brain injury. A flying rock struck his cortex.
Right.
He physically survived, but the specific damage destroyed his brain's ability to process cause and effect. If he dropped a glass and it shattered, his brain could no longer connect the dropping to the breaking.
And the collateral damage to his psyche was absolute.
Total devastation. Because he lost the concept of cause and effect, he essentially lost his humanity. He lost the ability to believe, to love, to grieve.
Wow.
Why? Because you can't love someone if you don't understand that their actions cause your happiness. If you are listening to this and wondering why a neurological quirk matters for theology, it's because the religious impulse relies entirely on cause and effect. Our healthy minds naturally trace the chain of creation back, step by step, until we arrive at the ultimate first cause, a creator.
The innate compass pointing to the divine.
Exactly. That is our fitra. That is all we actually need. We don't need an endless, complicated regression of human-made theological additions, special middle ground hadith categories, and magical prayers to untie knots.
Wow.
When we accept the natural limits of our mind, we strip away the historical noise. We return to the pure, unadulterated names of God, the Asma, as our only necessary interface.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that you are using the exact same aphorism to draw a conclusion that completely contradicts how human sociology actually works?
Explain that. How does it contradict?
You say, based on the principle that to see is to limit, we should strip away all human traditions. But if human cognition absolutely requires limitation in order to see clearly, then what do you think these historical traditions actually are?
They're inventions.
But the hadith categories, the formalized reverence, the specific poetic prayers, these aren't noise. These are the very limitations, the very lenses that human beings built over centuries. We built them to safely look toward the divine and the prophetic without being blinded by the sheer scale of it all.
Wait, so you're arguing that the traditions themselves are the eclipse glasses we talked about at the beginning?
Exactly. They are the filter. The lecture explicitly calls the divine names, the Isma, an atmosphere. The raw reality of God's essence is so overwhelming that without the atmosphere of the names, creation would literally burn up.
Right.
I am arguing that human religious tradition functions as a secondary atmosphere. When you look at the 3rd century scholars meticulously categorizing a hadith, or the mystics writing elaborate hyperbolic salawat, they weren't trying to obscure the truth. They were building cognitive and spiritual filters.
By creating fiction?
By creating structure. They were constructing the very limitations that the finite mind needs to focus on a reality that is otherwise too vast, too overwhelming, and too blinding to process. If you follow your logic and strip away all tradition, all poetry, all historical frameworks, in the name of a sterile, unmediated monotheism, you remove the atmosphere. And as the rule goes, without the atmosphere, you burn.
That is a remarkable way to flip the mechanism of the argument. It brings us to a really fascinating juncture as we wrap up today's exchange. To tie my perspective together, I still maintain that keeping an absolute, uncompromising distinction between the creator and the created requires rigorous, almost surgical theological precision.
Sure.
The historical accumulation of tradition, Whether it's giving the prophet's words a quasi-divine categorization or using hyperbolic language that borders on polytheism, eventually obscures the true nature of revelation. It obscures the prophet's actual, sweating, struggling humanity. Accepting our limits doesn't mean building our own lenses. It means relying strictly on the clear, unadulterated framework God provided, without the convoluted additions we invented to make ourselves feel better.
And from my side, while I agree that theological precision is the bedrock, a framework that purely dismantles tradition risks becoming profoundly sterile. It lacks sociological empathy.
Empathy.
Yes. The historical layers of reverence, even when they are flawed, even when the poetry gets hyperbolic, were not malicious deviations or lazy bribes. They were organic, necessary attempts by a massive civilization to build the required screens between human limitation and divine majesty. You simply cannot demand that the finite human mind interact with the infinite without allowing for the natural development of cultural and theological filters.
Well, I think we have reached a genuine point of convergence today, even if we disagree on the application. We both agree that the insight regarding human perception, that profound idea that to see is to limit, is a brilliant epistemological truth.
Absolutely.
How we choose to construct those limits is where the tension lies, but the insight itself is undeniable.
Oh, completely. And it's clear there is so much more to explore here, particularly regarding how the specific implementation of those 99 names, the Esma-ul Husna, actually functions in daily human ethics and behavior. I mean, there is a whole universe of practical application waiting to be unpacked.
There really is. We'll leave it to you, our listeners, to weigh the balance for yourselves. When does the necessity of theological rigor start to destroy the beauty of traditional reverence? And conversely, when does traditional reverence start to compromise the purity of faith?
Good questions.
But as you step outside today and feel the heat of the sun on your face, remember that the only reason you can safely enjoy its light is because of the atmosphere filtering its immense power. Whether that atmosphere should remain strictly divine, or whether human tradition has a necessary role in building it, that is the question we leave you with.
A profound question to carry with us.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.